Hey guys, Yips here, coming up in the video. Today I want to take some time to talk a little bit about my league start for 3.16. It's going to be an ED Contagion Occultist build. I truly think this is going to be one of the best league starters. ED Contagion is insane for clear. This build has good single target. It has everything I could possibly want. As I transfer from level 70 to 80 to 90 progression, getting gear should be fairly easy for the build. I feel like this is just going to be an excellent start for me, and I want to talk a little bit about the defenses in the build, how we scale our damage, what we're looking to do in the late game, and give you guys a little bit of an overview of the build and highlight it. Before we go into that, I'll talk a little bit about what Trickster lost in 3.15 and why I'm choosing Occultist in 3.16. So, moving from 3.15 to 3.16, everyone lost Fortify, which is just 20% flat phys mitigation, and physical damage is something that's really important to mitigate when you're playing any sort of build that's not armor based. And when you were playing ED Contagion Trickster, and when you do it now, you're running CI with Ghost Shrouds, which means you're an evasion based character. So you have a large amount of evasion, which does give you some physical damage avoidance, but it doesn't give you any physical damage mitigation. And in 3.15, you had Ghost Shrouds, which reduced your damage by 9% when you had 3 of them. You had the Fortify, which reduced it by an additional 20%, and if you wanted to, you also could be able to run the Wind Dancer notable, which also reduced it by an additional 20% on that first hit that hit you. We've pretty much lost all of that for Trickster, and by losing that, to pick up additional defenses, things like spell suppression now, things like increased energy shield, things like attack block, spell block, things that we got in the past are actually a lot harder to path through on the tree while picking up a substantial amount of damage. Maybe someone out there can figure out how to do it as a Trickster efficiently with a low gear budget, but when I was trying to path through Trickster, it was just an absolute nightmare headache to try to get 100% spell suppression, to get fizz damage DR, to get a good amount of energy shield, and to get attack and spell. No, it was just no. It wasn't as good, and when I swapped over to trying to work on an occultist, it was a lot easier. So I want to share with you those defensive layers now. So occultist, what sort of a defensive layers did I build with this guy to make it an absolute tank monster? I utilized the new ways of stacking auras in 3.16. So before in 3.15 we weren't able to stack as many auras, but now I'm running sovereignty, running influence, and running charisma, as well as all of the reservation masteries. I'm able to reserve a lot of my mana as auras, and the auras that I'm running are Determination and Defiance Banner for increased armor, Discipline for increased EHP, Malevolence for damage, and I have a level 2 Clarity socketed in for increased mana regeneration, and running Herald of Purity, which is actually Tempest Shield for shock immune and spell block. So a ton of powers are coming from auras because of the changes in 3.16, and because my tree is a lot more flexible, because I'm able to get more damage mitigation easily, I'm able to pick up all of these nodes that Trickster might not be able to. So with that, it allows me to get an insane amount of armor. I'm running 67k armor with my flasks active. Without having my flasks available to me, I have 37k armor, which is still a substantial amount against any physical hit that is going to hit me. So in this build, if I take a physical hit of 5,000, I'm able to reduce it with my pots up by 90%. That is actually just insane. Note that is with endurance charges, which you may not have early on with this build. Later into the late game, you will find ways to activate those through clusters, through rings, things of that nature, but early on you probably won't have this, which means you will be reducing that physical hit by less, but still, without endurance charges, reducing a hit by 5,000 by 73%, with this amount of EHP is just crazy for your physical damage reduction. So this build is an absolute tank at those physical hits. And in terms of dealing with spell damage, we rely on a large amount of spell block. There are more nodes available on the tree for more spell block if you want it. I personally don't think it will be necessary. I think that 56% is enough with ES on block and with the amount of regen the build will have to be able to compensate for the lack of additional spell mitigation like spell suppression. However, through things like Malediction, having an additional 10% less damage that enemies do to you, through the spell block that we do have and being capped on our resistances, I do feel like we are going to have enough elemental mitigation with this particular build. So let's talk a little bit about the regen that we have. We have a lot of spell mitigation, we have a lot of fizz mitigation. How do we regen it when that damage does come in? We are running the new notable Divine Shield, 3% of physical hits prevented recently is regenerated as energy shield per second. So what does this mean? The first cannot recover energy shield to above armor. Doesn't matter. We have 30k armor. We can't get 30k ES, so that's irrelevant for us. What does this mean? If we take a physical hit of 10,000 and we prevent 90% of it, that means we get hit for 1,000. 3% of that 90%, which is 270, so 270 damage is going to be regenerated as energy shield from that hit every second for the next 4 seconds. That means we're actually regenerating more energy shield than we took damage from that physical hit. Now, for this particular build, a hit around 5,000 is about where we cap out when we have our endurance charges active with us in terms of having that 90% DR where taking damage actually heals us. If we were to take a damage hit of 10,000 and reduce it by 74%, we would no longer be healing that much damage back. We would actually sustain some DPS, but we do have other ways of recovering that. But a hit of 5,000 is actually going to end up healing us on our particular build, so we do have a lot of regeneration from this Divine Shield notable when we're mapping, when we're taking physical hits. Where else do we get our recovery? We get it from Vile Bastion. It gives us flat energy shield regen per second, and it gives us energy regen if we've killed recently. So 10% of our ES, we do have a lot of flat ES as this build, is going to be regenerated if we are mapping and killing monsters at a consistent pace. We also get additional regeneration, if that wasn't enough, from our Essence Drain. Essence Drain is going to heal us for 0.5% of the debuff's damage as life. This isn't going to be an insane amount of recovery, but with everything combined together, as well as getting ES on block on this, life or ES on block on our shield, whenever we take these hits, we are going to be able to heal them back. So we have a lot of damage mitigation, and we have recovery, which is really what you need as a build in order to be tanky. Now, the one thing that gets a lot of builds is going to be damage over time. So things like Shaper Beam can melt builds really quickly, even if they have a lot of DR. Things like standing in puddles for a few seconds can melt people. Leaf Shade is going to be our way of combating that. It allows us to take 50% less damage if we've started taking damage recently in the past second. So say that you get hit by a Shaper Beam. For that very first second that you're being hit, you're taking half damage. It gives you time to react and to get out of that without being at too much of a detriment to your health pool. And then we'll be regenerating that through our other methods that I've talked about earlier. So this build really is a defense king with the amount of armor and the amount of recovery that you have. And you just have a lot of flat amount of HP for the enemies to burn through. You have 5.7k life with this build with reasonably rolled gear, around not quite T1 armor rolls on everything, but a reasonable amount of life on your gear, as well as a reasonable amount of energy shield on your gear. You can expect, I believe, around level 80, level 85, with some reasonable investment into the gear, say maybe you have 20, 30C worth of gear, you can probably expect to have around an 8 to 9k EHP pool, which is a lot for that level. You can easily, I would say, get this build online with 4k life and 3.5k ES. I don't think that's going to be too hard for anyone to hit with this build. We have enough percent increased life and enough percent increased ES in order for that to be a reasonable standard for people to get early on when they're starting mapping. So tons of EHP, tons of regeneration, and tons of damage reduction. So that's why this build is just king defensively and why I'm playing it over Trickster. Where does our damage come from and how do we scale it? So with this particular build, our damage is going to be coming on single target from Blight. And the way that we scale that is through our Aura, Malevolence, our two curses, Despair and Temporal Chains, and damage notables on the tree in terms of the Chaos ones. Now, the reason why Temporal Chains, if you didn't know, scales our damage is because it allows our Blight to last longer on the mob, meaning we can get more stacks. That also means that cast speed can also scale our damage because if we're able to apply Blight faster, we can apply more stacks to the enemy. So, let's take a look at ways that we can scale damage further than I already have listed here. So I'm taking the Wither effect and the Chaos Multiplier per 4 Chaos Resistance, as well as these notables, Growth and Decay. But if you want more damage, you can drop some defense. You can drop some Spell Block in order to pick up additional damage here through Acrimony. If you want to pick up more damage here on Fangs of the Viper, on Wasting, you can do that. You can drop some defense from this build in order to get more offense. Don't drop your mana passives. You need the mana to sustain your Blight, But you can drop things like like spell block if you feel like it's not necessary for a build like this in order to bring the damage more online. So if I was to choose to drop this and I was to not run a cluster setup and I was to just pick a few more of these damage notable setups, you can already see that the damage at maximum stacks goes up quite a bit. Okay, so you do have options if you want to scale the damage more if you don't feel like running such a hardcore viable build. So that's the defenses in terms of what we have and the damage scaling we have on our Blight. What are you going to be wanting to do when you're doing something like mapping with this build, when you're playing through the game and you want to map? You're going to be using Essence Drain linked on your gloves. Your gloves should have 30% increased damage over time multiplier, and then also, sorry, 30 socketed skills deal 30% more damage over time, I believe it is, and then +2 to projectiles in terms of skills. That would put your Essence Drain like this, and you can see your ED dealing almost 500k DPS on a boss like Cirrus, and if you have that 30% more, that's going upwards of 600k. So a lot of damage from your Essence Drain, and we're spreading that through the map via Contagion with increased area of effect and intensity. So big contagions going out on all the mobs. You Essence Drain one down, that proliferates through all the monsters, and it will clear your screen. Very, very solid in terms of mapping. When you get to a boss and you want to be applying your Despair and Temporal Chains, mapping, it might not be as big of a deal. Sure, just hit your Despair on the enemy and that will give you a good amount of damage on the boss. Don't really probably need to worry too much about temp chains, but when you're going to fight something like Sirius or something like that, change your contagion to Bane. Link your temp chains and despair to that. It gives you an extra dot that does around 200k DPS to those guys, which will add on to your single target, but it will also increase the effectiveness and just apply those curses for free. So that's sort of how I get around the amount of skills that this build has to deal with. Is on bossing, you would just change your contagion for Bane, slot in those abilities, and run with that. If you don't want to do that, that's okay. Self-caster curses. And when you're mapping, I wouldn't recommend thinking about it at all. You can maybe get a Despair on trigger wand ring, something like, or on wand, something like that if you really don't feel like casting these things. That can help you out in that sense. So that's how we're going to be doing damage to single target and clearing in our bosses. That's how you want to end up scaling your damage, is through those ways. You can run clusters if you want. You are close to a few of them here, and you can change them out. Personally, I don't feel like it's worth it for me because I'll be playing solo self-found and getting clusters as a pain and rolling them as a pain, and you already have enough to worry about. But on softcore trade or hardcore trade, you're more able to get access to these things, so it could be worth looking into cluster setups. If you take a look here, you can see that your damage can go up quite a bit if you pick up clusters, and these are the sort of clusters you're looking for: Conjured Wall, Spell Block, Mage Hunter Spell Block, Student of Decay, Flow of Life, give you more life. This has Enduring Composure, which gives you endurance charge generation. So if you want to, you can go into a cluster setup, but personally for me, I prefer just having this tree as a baseline for me to run, and if later into the game I want to work towards clusters, and if that's going to be better for me, that's what I will do. Now, in terms of pathing and game progression, the notables that you can drop early on are things like your block notables, Sanctum of Thought, the increased armor, Faith and Steel, this endurance charge, and any sort of gem sockets that you have can be dropped early on if you want to have more skill points because you're not quite there yet. So say you're level 87, this could be a pretty typical skill tree. However, I'd probably more path into the spell block and probably drop something like Growth and Decay, drop some damage, so I have a little bit more survivability, drop things like Entropy. But the main things that you really do need to get with this build, regardless if you're playing on hardcore or softcore and want to run this build, is you need to get all of the reservation nodes. You need to get sovereignty, you need to get influence, and you need to get charisma. The managed nodes are also fairly necessary, as without them you'll have a really hard time sustaining and being able to cast your skills. So keep that in mind, that these nodes aren't there because they help you with EHP defensively or help you with damage. They just allow you to use your abilities. So sovereignty, we're using the reservation mastery. Over here we have the aura skills have increased effect on you. We're running 6 auras, so that's incredibly important. And here we have 8% increased damage for each aura or herald skill affecting you. Obviously very powerful because we are running 6 auras. That's 48% increased damage on one node. Definitely very worthwhile. So this is the tree, this is the build, this is how I set up. In terms of gearing, you're just going to want to look for armor ES gear with high amounts of life on it. Pretty straightforward, percent armor, percent ES, and increased life. You want to get a chest piece where you can get the 10% of maximum life as extra energy shield. Crown of the Inward Eye from Cirrus is going to be an excellent addition if you're able to get it. It gives you transfiguration of, which one is it that gives you more damage? Soul, which is an excellent damage increase. And then down here you can change your anoint to Potency of Will, which gives you increased skill effect duration, helps your blight out a lot on single targets. So overall, this is the build I'll be playing. It looks really solid. Your EHP calcs are just insane. You can tank so much with this build. You're going to have an insane amount of regen. Mapping should feel buttery smooth, and I think it will take me into the late game pretty far. So thanks for watching. Hopefully this brought you guys some insight on this build and why it should be so powerful moving into 3.16, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.